Modern Britain, a case of the bland leading the bland. From our clothes to our music to the high street, Sam Delaney examines our increasing homogenization in Don't Get Me Started.
Britain, former home of great music, inspiring culture, people in interesting hats, has now become a depressing wasteland of blandness. Look around you at these garish neon shops that all look identical. People like a cloned army of billboards for international sportswear conglomerates, all marching up and down the high street to a soundtrack of terrible music provided by talent show excrement. It's depressing, isn't it? Don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of the onward march of capitalism. The fact that we've all got a generally better standard of living, a few more quid in our pocket, the fact that there's fine Italian cheeses available on the high street at affordable prices, those are all good things, but it seems to me that the unfortunate side effect is that we've lost a bit of our individuality, a bit of flair, a bit of originality. It's like we've all lapsed into a terrible cultural coma. It's going to take a big old slap round the face to wake us up again. Welcome to the Groundhog Day nightmare that is living in modern Britain. We wake up, we shuffle out onto the streets, every one of which looks exactly the same. We eat sandwiches and slurp coffee that taste, look and smell identical. Every one of us is plugged into an iPod listening to the same music that's not that bad, but not that good either. Then we get home, switch on the TV and make that recipe Jamie Oliver was talking about on an advert. This might be a more civilised country than it used to be, but it ain't half bland. Could it be we've all been bought off by mocha lattes, pre-packaged sushi and round-the-clock football updates live from the Sky Sports Centre? Are we all happy enough to sit around in this comfort zone? Of course we are, and it's a crying shame. Great British shopping mall. They started to spring up about 20 years ago or so. But I tell you what, these days it feels to me like the whole country is one giant shopping mall. From Edinburgh to Watford, these chain store littered high streets look so similar that you're hard-pressed to know where you are at any given time. If it wasn't for street signs, I'd probably find myself lost, lonely and confused on a daily basis. I mean, it might just be my own paranoia and rampant neurosis, but it's almost like these identikit environments can send you clean round the bend.
I think homogenization was a term that was usually used for milk. What it seems to mean culturally is the fact that there is far less variety than you would normally expect.
Remember quaint little shops like these ones? Yeah, rubbish, weren't they? But at least they had some character about them. These days, huge international superstores perform a panzer movement on our high streets.
Then what are we going to get for you this morning?
Trouble is, these big companies seem hell-bent on making the whole country look identical. It's weird. I don't suppose there's many people missing the pound shops and haberdasheries that filled the high streets 20 years ago, but most of us miss living in a town that had its own identity. One that reflected the culture of the people, not the taste of some sinister corporate design guru.
There's a funny scene in an episode of The Simpsons where Bart's walking down a shopping mall, and in 1 minute it's lots of different independent shops, and he walks back down the same mall 5 minutes later and they've all become Starbucks.
It's almost as if people in these huge high street companies are designing our town centres. And they seem convinced that huge, putrid neon migraines are the best way to liven up the high street and flog their wares. Perhaps they reckon if they don't rub their signs right in our faces, we won't buy their sandwiches. Take Tesco. They've got 500 Tesco Metros currently adorning the streets of Britain and want to double that number over the next few years. That garish red and blue sign will soon replace the Union Jack as our national emblem. This is a company that pockets £1 in every 7 spent in the UK. You'd have thought with that money they could pay someone good to design their stores. I went to chat about this with Stephen Bailey. He's a bit of a design guru and he's not a big fan of Tesco.
I mean, I feel slightly insulted by the idea that these shops have to kind of almost grab me by the face and ram the brightly coloured names of their shops down my throat.
It's the commercial equivalent of, of getting nutted, and no one, no one wants that.
I mean, this is a great example where Tesco's have taken what's a really nice building and destroyed it.
Tesco had the option. It could have gone for beauty and charm and delight and responsibility. Instead, it's made an absolutely conscious decision to go for crass ugliness. And that really annoys me, and it should annoy you too.
I feel very annoyed. I guess they'd argue that it's all about presence, and that, you know, to have the presence, you need to have this kind of big, bright branding.
Yeah, well, that's an insult to the consumer. Yeah, of course you need a strong identity, but strength is not the same as coarseness, and what we have here is coarseness. You know, I believe the consumer responds better, to subtle messages delivered with care, messages about, our corporate presence, which says, we're sensitive and responsible, and we respect your feelings and your ambitions. Not that, sod off, we're here. What we admire in architecture and design is exactly what we admire in people. We admire humour. Personality, difference, the ability to express oneself. And, that's what architecture design is all about. It's not about, some slavish search for a, modish style. It's about buildings and environments which express personality and have meaning. Yeah. And that fundamentally is one's objection to, brainless, uniform, corporate retail design plonked everywhere. So I'm absolutely emphatically not against, large companies. I'm not against profit. I just think that, that what one wants from big companies is an intelligent response to context and to human needs. What we can take comfort from, is that, yes, the high street of Britain is pretty damned awful at the moment, most of them, uniformity, lack of character. But, as soon as it gets to that sort of stability, it's absolutely instinctive in humankind to rebel against it. So, I'm not without optimism for the future, but I'm full of criticism for the present.
Yeah. Stephen might talk in a very, very posh voice, but that doesn't actually make him a snob. I mean, I'm in agreement with him on most of that stuff. Neither of us object to these big companies opening their shops all over the place and selling what they want. I mean, we're not communists, are we? The point is, can't they encourage us to come to their shops just by selling great stuff and selling it at low prices? Why do they have to do it in such a visually hideous way that's so offensive on our high streets?
I don't think there's really anything wrong with these national chains, these superstores, replacing the good old corner shop. The reason Books, etc., and Waterstones and W.H. Smith have thrived and largely replaced the neighbourhood bookshop is because they actually just provide a better service.
I guess we are to be thankful for places like Starbucks for upping the quality of things, but I don't know, I kind of, maybe I'm just getting misty-eyed about it, but I'd rather drink a watery cup of coffee in somewhere that was family-owned and wasn't lined with plastic and had, Norah Jones on heavy rotation on the radio.
When I was growing up in Hammersmith, the shops were rubbish. Budgin, Londis and Kebabarama didn't make for an interesting high street. When McDonald's opened a local branch, we almost staged a street party in celebration.
See this? This was actually my first local McDonald's. I remember it really well when it opened when I was about 9. It's a magnificent, life-changing day for me and every other kid in the area. And it was about this time, I probably didn't notice it, but every other shop in this street started to get the big branded garish neon signs outside, and I didn't know at the time, but everywhere else in the country was going the same way, because it was about that time that sinister marketing men started to think that if you really wanted your brand to be successful, you had to ram it down people's throats every single day.
But while we merrily gorged on Egg McMuffins, a sinister invasion was afoot. Next came the Colonel and his secret chicken, then Burger King and their Whoppers. The marketing men were seducing us with a heady cocktail of saturated fat and neon perspex, and we were gobbling it up like maniacs. Peter York was around at the height of punk when everyone strove to be different. Then in the 80s, he worked in an advertising industry that strove to make everyone the same. I went to ask him how we became the homogenised country we are today.
Mrs. T's great triumph was to make us more like America in all sorts of ways, to recruit a much larger middle class in the American sense. We now have a very large economic middle class, which has nice houses full of all sorts of comforts. And that does take the edge off things. You're right there.
When was it that when, sinister marketing types like yourself decided that the way in which to kind of feed us these brands was to ram them violently down our throats?
Well, you can't blame me entirely. I will take some of the blame, but we all wished for it, you see. In the 70s, we had a national chip on the shoulder, top to bottom of the nation. You wanted the nice stuff that the Europeans had got, and you wanted the money that the Americans had got.
Point is that they still have that in Europe, but they don't. You walk down a high street in Rome or Paris or Milan, and there's not this avalanche of neon.
Get real, young man, I say, at this point. It will happen to them. One of the reasons is that their economies aren't as Americanized as ours is. The balance between the public and the private sector is different there. All those things that I think, for better or worse, are going to come. And they will have high streets that look just like ours.
The thing about walking around in England is you could easily get lost and afraid on a daily basis because everything looks so similar. You don't know whether you're in Watford or Wigan half the time, do you?
That is true. That's because our shops have been got so efficient and so big. Our retail groups got so efficient and so big so fast. Retailers learnt in the 1980s that they could run the world. They had the ear and the eye of consumers all the time. And if they did something instead of just sitting there, you know, invented their own products, made their shops look lovely, brought new things in, they could bully the people who actually made things, the branded manufacturers. You have to be big to do that. You have to have buying clout. You have to have more buying clout than the next big retailer. They weren't thinking, oh, let's homogenize, let's drive out every bit of indigenous culture.
But economically speaking, they were better having a huge amount of standardised produce.
It's not a unique invention, it's just an extension of any colour as so long as it's black.
Broadly speaking, is it a good or a bad thing that we've reached this state?
I think it's a good thing that we've reached this state for the broad mass of people, but it will always cause thoughtful young intellectual types like yourself to be unhappy. Because you are right, but I think the exchange is a fair one.
So ultimately, who is to blame for this homogenised clone society we live in?
Number one, Margaret Thatcher, who aimed to make our society and our economy more like America, and she succeeded. Perpetuated by Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. I blame design. Technology is to blame. The expansion of higher education is to blame. The city and Big Bang is very much to blame. Therapy culture, I blame therapy culture too. I was going to say I blame Jamie Oliver, but you can't, can you?
So as far as Peter's concerned, we asked for this world we live in now, and now we've got it. I think there's a certain irony, though, in the fact that he's one of the marketing guys who played a massive part in homogenising our society, and now, like me, he's sitting around moaning about it. Although for me, that only softens the blow a tiny bit.
Why not blame the consumers? If you don't blame them, then you shouldn't consider them adults and you shouldn't consider them individuals. And if you're going to consider the population to be free-thinking individuals, then they have to take some of the blame, I'd say most of the blame. They have opened their wallets, they have bought these images, they have yearned to look this way, and they should be held accountable for it.
Everything is good now, everything or appears to be good anyway in terms of design. From, you know, everybody has a stainless steel kitchen, everybody kind of appreciates a contemporary design, everybody eats good food, but I think because everything has become so good, it becomes more and more bland. There's no benchmarks of naff anymore.
It's natural that we all want more stuff, better stuff, cheaper stuff, and God bless capitalism, that's what it's given us. But we've embraced the trappings of this more affluent world at the expense of our individuality. Look out your window or switch on your telly. No one wants to stand out anymore.
In theoretical biology, there is an idea that we are pre-programmed to conform, and that we copy the successful and that we copy the majority. Now, this is a necessary instinct we have to provide us with cooperation in a civilized society so that we all form a queue and don't start a riot. But what seems to have happened is that big business and the media have hijacked that tendency that we have and gave us things to conform to, ways of dressing, ways of behaving, music to listen to.
It just feels like we've kind of collectively lost our nerve it's kind of a shock of the new, I guess. Anything that feels slightly uncomfortable or that feels too new or kind of vaguely dangerous is something that terrifies us these days.
In the 1990s, James Brown launched Loaded, a magazine that used to celebrate individuality and eccentricity. But all mags do these days is tell you how to look exactly like the next person. So what went wrong?
You know, you're saying that people are coming homogenised by so many brands. I think what it does, it takes the fear out of shopping.
Yeah.
And it takes the fear out of your choices. Because people don't want to get it wrong. And if you get a Ted Baker shirt, or if you buy, you know, a specific pair of Adidas trainers, and you know that you'll be seen as being right by your mates, and everyone wants peer approval.
Adidas says you've got a positive attitude, and Nike says that you like to look good.
I mean, you could come in wearing a coat made out of cabbages, but if it said Vivienne Westwood, you go, oh, wow, great coat.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that youth cultures do still start with some weird kids sitting in bedrooms or in skate parks, wherever they hang out, and then people latch onto it afterwards. But I think the difference is that huge corporations are very, very trend aware now, and they're obsessed with like cool hunters and agencies that can find them the next big thing.
Yeah.
And that probably wasn't the case a decade ago.
So perhaps things become absorbed quicker.
The media has just exploded, so you can reach anything you want immediately.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like that in the past. So people had more time, there was more dark corners where people's interests can fester and their obsessions can build.
Yeah.
Whereas you can sort of lance the boil of your obsession just like that.
Do you think like 10 years ago, when you first launched Loaded, the sort of magazines that people bought, the kind of thinking was people wanted to be different, a bit individual?
The magazine initially was a triumph of character over blandness, and it was a magazine about the way guys wanted to be rather than how they were told they should be by the more sophisticated style press of the day. It was partially successful because we were obsessed with the characters who were the outsiders, and we were very much interested in people who really did stand out. It does seem to me that sort of blip of characters being sort of paved over again.
David Beckham is the perfect example, this kind of blander sort of...
Yeah, no, Beckham is the modern granddaddy of branding. He has become the template for all young, blingy pop stars, footballers and wannabes. They feel that to be a celebrity, you've sort of got to look like all the other celebrities, I think.
Beckham's style is dictated to him by stylists, but then other people are having their look dictated to them by David Beckham.
You can become famous, relatively famous, so quickly, just simply by being on a reality show, whereas go back to the 70s, there was only Jim or Fix It, where normal people got to go on telly. So suddenly there's been this sort of democratisation of television, whereby anyone really can become a celebrity. And the idea of being famous for something doesn't really matter anymore. You know, I had no trouble whatsoever in the mid-90s filling Loaded magazine with 300 pages of interesting people. And a lot of the times the audience were discovering these people for the first time because they didn't know anything about them, whereas nowadays you pick up the Sunday Telegraph and the guy from the Libertines, you know, the junkie pop stars all over the front of the Sunday Tory press. You know, it probably took you to 5 albums before they got mentioned in the Sun.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably to do with, you know, just mainstream media being much more aware that youth culture and entertainment sells papers and stuff than ever before.
Back when Loaded first started, it seemed that being cool was all about being different and going out on a limb. Now, as soon as anything's labelled cool, it's bought up by the mainstream, repackaged and sold onto a mass market. Cool comes neatly freeze-dried and shrink-wrapped these days. Hey, open a copy of Heat, it'll tell you how to buy it all in Topshop. In part 2, I'm going to find out why and when we all stopped using our imaginations and decided to have our music and fashion tastes spoon-fed to us. I want to find out why everyone wants to look like Duncan from Blue these days, and most importantly of all, who's responsible for this.
On occasion, for security purposes, the Secret Service hires someone to double for the president.
We got to feel like he's sitting right here in this chair.
Are you saying this is a conspiracy? This is not my beautiful house. And you may tell yourself, this is not my beautiful wife.
I'm the president, and as they say, the buck stops here.
Kevin Kline and Sigourney Weaver star in Dave. 8 o'clock tomorrow on 5.
When I went to sleep, where I went to sleep, what I ate, what I did, everything was by instruction. It was like having a prison cell that just followed you around. It is a horrific feeling being locked in.
For 10 years, he convinced her that he was a spy. He wasn't. The exclusive feature-length documentary, The Spy Who Stole My Life. 10 o'clock tomorrow on 5.
This is a film about clone Britain. This is the Britain of Alco-Pops in all bar one on Friday nights. Sky TV, cappuccinos for all, pedestrianised city centres where we can all look like Robbie Williams for one night with a quick trip to Top Man and a tube of studio line. The high streets that look the same from Watford to Wigan, the karaoke pop tunes that fill the radio waves, the reality TV shows that slowly kill our brains on a nightly basis. Music used to be the soundtrack to youthful rebellion. Now there's no room for anyone to innovate or say something new, different, or even a bit offensive. Who is there on top of the pops who's really going to shock and disgust us?
Britain tried to, I suppose, reclaim the idea of being cool Britannia sometime in the 1990s. It was cool in the 60s and really did provide the world with an utterly different way of looking and listening to music. But really it seemed to be a desperate attempt and almost a reaction to the truth, which was that Britain was becoming far more conformist. It was not cool Britain at all, it was conformist Britain.
A handful of behemoth record companies bestride the globe, deciding what records make it onto the racks at HMV. The stakes are high in their business, so they don't have much interest in taking gambles on mavericks. And by mavericks, I mean artists with any semblance of imagination. They prefer soppy bands manufactured by TV shows who can make them a fast buck before disintegrating into an undignified mess.
These were the most famous pop stars in Britain less than 2 years ago, and it's a sort of sorry end to a tale of instant pop.
They're just 5 normal people who can sing and dance a bit, put together by some clever people who came up with some good songs. And after a time, you fall apart. And of course, when you fall apart, it makes no difference to the record company because they've got another one in the line. There's another TV show in the line. There's another reality band popping out on the production line. But for, 5 people in here, say, it's a tough day.
Rather than take the risk of signing new talent, labels drop all but a few multi-million selling artists and survive on back catalogues.
There are too many people following too many other people, and there aren't quite enough people breaking away and going, well, sod that, I'm going to go and do this.
Of course, Britain used to export musical innovation to the world. We gave them the Beatles, we gave them punk rock. Now we give them Coldplay and Dido. It's embarrassing.
That's entertainment. That's entertainment.
80% of the world's music is owned by just 4 companies: Universal, EMI, Warner and Sony BMG. Universal and Sony BMG are now the 2 biggest music companies in the world and earn about 25% of the market each.
We have a problem these days in that major record companies revolve on a much quicker profit basis. The boss gets a bonus at the end of the year. So if he's launching an album by an artist, he wants that artist to be successful on their first album. These days, if they're not broken in the first 9 months, or the first year, certainly on the first album, then there won't be a second album. Music journalists and record companies who are in league together without probably realising it, they're the ones who are driven by fashion more than anybody else. The record companies are driven by fashion because they want to make money and move along quickly and get into the next act, and the journalists are driven by it because they want something new to write for the next week's paper, and so the two without realising it, collaborating, and again, everybody going, oh, I've got to move forward and I've got to write something, I've got to write something new so that these people will take notice of me.
Thing is, in any era, there's always going to be an underground scene that's kind of fighting against the mainstream, and where once stood the Smiths, now stand the Libertines. But I mean, those kind of miserable malcontents, they're just so fringe that they're not really relevant. If you really want to take the cultural temperature of a generation, you've got to look at the mainstream. And in terms of music, we're talking about pop. And back in the 80s and even now, pop music was the sort of stuff I was into. But back then, you had the bands that dominated the British charts and the American charts with great British pop acts like Wham and Duran Duran and Spandau Ballet. And the thing about those bands were they were real bands that kind of grew up as schoolmates, and they sort of had years and years to cultivate their look and their sound and their whole persona, and their whole raison d'etre, if you'll pardon my French, was to stand out from the crowd. That's why they wore makeup or ruffled shirts, or like in the case of Wham, tight denim hot pants. I mean, each to their own, you know. They all wanted to stand out. Now, pop bands, the only reason people are in them is because they want to be famous. And the last thing these days you do, if you want to be famous, is to look different. What you got to do to get a record executive to take a chance on you is to look exactly the same as everyone else. So it's a complete reverse, and that's why we get Duncan from Blue, and I'll ask you to pardon my French there as well. I mean, when Boy George used to come on top of the pops, your mum used to be disgusted and spit at the TV screen. Now, when Duncan or Robbie come on, she goes, oh, isn't he a nice chap? And then she goes out and buys their greatest hits down at Tesco's.
I think that's a really good illustration of how bland this country's become, that, you know, a country that was previously famed for having really angry and aggressive and unapproachable youth, have suddenly just kind of rolled over and, you know, and accepted kind of conformity. And to the extent now where you go shopping down, you know, down your local mall, rocking exactly the same clothes as your mum and dad. I mean, what happened? Awful.
Yeah, as for fashion, the days of distinctive tribes are nearly over. There's a university popular look that's starting to dominate the high street that seems to involve a lot of tan, some highlighted hair, and very often funny little beards. It's all neatly explained on a weekly basis in those Get the Look magazine articles. Handy, huh? Phil Tarlin has styled everyone from Robbie Williams to Duncan from Blue, often under strict instructions from the record companies.
Pop star, you generally get quite a tight brief from the men on the top to say, this is your pop star. A record company, execs, or their management say, these are the boys or the girls, this is how we want them to look. They invariably say, I don't want them to look too much like this person or that person. Take a little bit of a Jamie, take a little bit of Will, take a little bit of Blue, mix it together and come up with something creative.
Right.
On a budget.
It strikes me you do get a lot of bands who do look pretty similar, and so is that the fault of the record companies who basically don't want to take a big chance on something that's too radically different from the last band?
Record labels know what sells. They have a formula that works, and so why change a formula for another formula when you're guaranteed success with this formula?
So it's very much business driven.
Some artists are talented, but their look is way more important than their talent. I think we can look at some kind of girl bands in the past whose looks and image way outweighed their talent and ability to sing.
People used to try and plough their own furrow and make up their own look, and now it's just like what they like to do is pick up some naff old magazine, see a Get the Look feature, they tell you exactly where to get your t-shirt, your trousers, your shoes, and you go and buy the whole thing and still have change left over for a bag of chips on the way home, and all you do is just end up looking like Robbie or Duncan from Blue or some sort of terrible soulless creature.
Well, yeah, I mean, it sounds really, you make it sound quite grim and quite bad, but then at the end of the day, celebrities are pitched at being very aspirational, and a lot of people want to look like a celebrity. There's deep meaning in some people looking like Britney or looking like Gwen Stefani. People find a bit of meaning in life by dressing like them. So I guess for 50 quid, it's a peace of mind that you're not going to get it wrong because some magazine have said, this is not bling, it's bling.
Nowadays, because everything's so readily available and at such a, affordable price, that it's kind of killed people's imagination a little bit because they can just be spoon-fed it by the media, by big businesses, by the high street. They're just spoon-fed what they have to wear and how they have to look, and they're spoon-fed their whole lifestyle, so they don't kind of like, do things that are individual anymore.
Potentially, but then life is about choices. You can choose to pick up a magazine, you can choose to flick through the Get the Look feature, and you can choose to decide to look like Britney or not.
But more people are choosing to do that than they used to, aren't they?
Excuse me, girls, where are you from? Liverpool. Can we spare 1 minute of your time to come and have a quick chat with us?
What celebrities you admire for their fashion sense?
Sienna Miller.
What celebrities do you two admire for their fashion sense?
Oh, it has to be Sienna Miller for me. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. I've just bought a dress that's like hers.
Would you actually go as far as to seek out the clothes you see them wearing in magazines?
You are for tonight, haven't you? She's got stuff like that for tonight.
And you girls try to sort of mimic that style a little bit?
No, I'd love to.
But is it an influence on when you're out shopping the clothes? It's an influence on your style, yeah?
Yeah. Well, also the high street copies,
Yeah.
And a lot of the stuff in the shops at the moment are, her entire wardrobe.
Doesn't that take the edge off it a little bit?
It does, yeah, it does. By the end of the season, you're sick to death of it. Like,
yeah, because so with your fashion sense, is it like very influenced by like the sort of celebrities you admire?
Yeah, definitely. Every day I look through magazines, get ideas, what to wear.
Yeah. So it's very much governed by those kind of get the look. Do you like those get the look things? They tell you can get the same.
Sometimes they're a bit bad, like they never do it right. But
really? Do you actually get the magazines and look at those things like the get the look stuff and things like that?
We work.
Oh right, so you're the guys doing the get the look thing, right?
Yeah, we're the guilty party.
It seems to me like people's entire look, like we've been looking here on the high street and there's a bunch of Sienna Miller clones who are walking on. And like the girls we just spoke to, they're probably happy to admit that. That's the look they're going for. So it's much more, they look at celebrities as their kind of template. Of course it's a tasteful and stylish look, but almost too tasteful and stylish. So much so that no one's interested in rocking their own look. Just pick up a copy of Sienna Monthly and see page 86 for stockist details.
All you really need to do is pop down Selfridges, buy a handful of brands that you think define you, and suddenly, you've got your personality and your identity all summed up in that collection of brands. The only problem is that, a bloke couple of seats down in the pub has probably got the same idea and is wearing exactly the same stuff.
I think we have to remember that people do not interact as much anymore. There was a time when people physically saw other people. They gathered and had what are called common experiences, and they have a chance to see real people dressing in their own idiosyncratic individual ways. Nowadays, people don't. People have far less contact with one another, and what they do have contact with are a very few role models presented to them through the media, through the new magazines like Now, OK, and so on, and through a narrow range of television programs. And I think it's that lack of variety of role models presented through one narrow tube which has caused people to just accept these are the offerings on the menu in terms of which kind of social code I'm going to buy into, and that's where all the conformity is coming from.
Perhaps we should blame the sinister marketing men who specialise in pouncing on any new idea the moment it's born, then quickly sterilising it, repackaging it and blandifying it for a mass market before it's even had a chance to breathe. I'm visiting some youth marketing experts at a company called SLAM, which stands for Sex, Love and Marketing. I'm not joking. So here we are at SLAM, which stands for Sex, Love and Marketing. First of all, why is it called that?
I don't know, honestly.
The way I understand it from the research we've been doing today is what you marketing people do is you find out what's cool one day, you take it, you repackage it, homogenise it, mass produce it, and then flog it on a mass scale to everyone else. Is that right?
I know that some marketers do try and create this mass messaging, this mass product, and present it to as many people as possible in a nicely formed package. But at SLAM, what we do is we kind of get involved with smaller niche groups, and then these style leaders will perhaps influence larger groups.
They want a knock-on effect. And what are the unconventional techniques that you guys use, if you can tell me?
We identify a group that we want to target, and then we it's almost like method acting. You've got to get involved with that group, or you've got to get close to someone like friends of SLAM who do live that lifestyle.
Who are the friends of SLAM?
Well, SLAM's got a network of who we call slammers and slamettes around the UK, made up of journalists, photographers, kids who are writing zines, people who are going to gigs, everyone who from friends of friends who are at school to people that we know within the industry.
You've got them embedded in the schools, some of them?
We haven't, it's not like we've got spies in schools. We've got, friends of our company who are telling us, what's hot, what's going on.
Are they on the payroll, these people?
They're not on the payroll.
So what do they get out of it?
Well, they just get to report back to us. I mean, we're not asking them for an awful lot. They're just kind of keeping an ear to the ground. They're telling us what's going on.
It's interesting, though, because ultimately someone somewhere's making money out of this information.
They can't tell us how to convince their group what to buy. That's a myth of PR. What they can do is they can tell us, you know, what they're watching, what they're listening to. Some of the research you'll get out of the big media houses isn't always reliable. So we go to our slammers and slamettes around the country, and they'll tell us how best to communicate with their target group.
So there you have it. It's actually worse than I thought. These marketing people are being paid by big businesses to find out what's cool, and then they're sanitising it and shrink wrapping it and selling it all back to us at a profit, which is kind of scary, I suppose. But it gets even worse than that when you learn about these cool spies they've got lurking in the shadows all over the place, finding out what's down with the kids. I mean, who are these weird figures who are hanging around on street corners and finding out what jeans they should tell us to wear? I'm going to go and find some. These are the cool hunters, people like Martin Raymond, who runs the Future Laboratory. It's a worldwide network of trend spotters, informing everything from car manufacturers to fashion houses on what the next big thing might be. You come to like trendy little markets like this, and what do you do? Kind of basically lap up what you think is going to be cool and then sell it on to the mainstream? Is that the way that
Sort of, not quite as easy as that. I mean, first of all, you're coming to places like Portobello, for example, to observe. What you're looking for is where trends are at, and then you're looking for what I call the anomalous person or the oddity that you see, which you think, now what are they doing? And they're kind of probably good indicators of where the next trend is coming from.
So what you're saying is that they're fashions that you think are going to happen anyway, but your job is to spot them just before they start.
Yes, you have in your head, I suppose, a set of images that you've seen, you know, in Paris, in London, in Milan, you know, streets in Mumbai, in Estonia. So you've got all of this information crowding in. Then you kind of see, is it on the street? Yes, it is. Where on the street? Because, for example, if I see it in Oxford Street, I'm not interested. Oxford Street is where all bad fashions die.
Yeah.
Places like Portobello is where fashions start. You know, the British high street is quite unique to any retail sector in the world, because most retail sectors are selling brands by designers.
Yeah.
So there's a connection between creativity and what you find in the store. In the high street, it's almost the opposite. You've got buying teams of merchandisers who are a bit like committees out looking and arbitrating, and they kind of come together and they say, well, look, it's vintage, it's Margaret Thatcher chic, it's retro fogey, and it's whatever.
Yeah.
And they go and buy the component parts, and the problem is not only do they buy it, they have to dilute it down, because as well as the woman that comes from that bit of town where it's sexy to wear this, they have to think of the woman who's come up from Romford for the day, who wants to look sexy when she goes home, but doesn't want to look too idiotic. You know, the problem with the high street, it's not just replicating fashion in a bland way, it's replicating the high street all over Britain in a bland way.
I think it would be like a real surprise to you know, your average punter that you have such a huge network of these people, and things that used to just happen naturally for years. You know, trends would grow up on the street, and then very slowly people at big chain stores might become conscious of them and then sell on their own version years later. I mean, you've got an army, a network of cool spies who are kind of looking constantly, and the moment things start to happen, they're spotted and that information's flogged on.
It is, but there is another, I suppose, area that we look at, because at the moment there are other debates that are not necessarily about trends but influence trends. What does it mean to sustainability? What does it mean to the environment? What does it mean to corporate and social responsibility? These are issues that 10 years ago business or the high street weren't thinking about. Now they are forced to think about it. Why? Because oddly the customer is thinking about it.
To me at the moment, the idea of like these ethical consumers, it seems like it's only going to be a small group of people who can afford to.
The idea of, you know, buying organic food was only cranky people who wore Cornish pasty shoes. Now stores like Iceland sell organic food, and even people who don't pay attention understand the relationship between the food they eat and the food and where it's produced. And I think more people want it to be so, and gradually economics will demand it, and more importantly, trends will demand it, because trends are what drive profit ultimately. And if tomorrow's trend is about organics, believe you me, even the supermarket that has no view about ethics or morals whatsoever will be selling organics, because that's where the money is coming from.
We live in a world where there's no lifestyle until it's a commodity. We might not always notice it, but almost every aspect of our lives is corporately driven. Of course, that's not such a bad thing. For most of us, it makes life freer, more interesting, and awash with tasty coffee. The downside, a cloned, standardised and dull environment. Martin thinks we're on the verge of a backlash. But is there desire there? I mean, after all, modern living is comfortable living. But hey, what's going to happen if we get too comfortable?
And what's going to happen if we become an increasingly godless Britain? Next Tuesday's Don't Get Me Started at the same time. Next tonight, we revisit 9/11 with the firefighter's story.